another of our first-person history series. This is going to be great tonight, growing up in the 40s and 50s in Pocahontas. I know we're going to have, I think, 3 more sessions. We've had to make some changes in the schedule, so I want to report them to you tonight. Next week, we're going to have the new interpreter at Davidsonville Park because it's their 200th anniversary out there. And he's going to tell us firsthand some of the history out there from a real historian's point of view. And tell us about all the people who came through there, like Stephen Austin and Daniel Boone and everybody like that. So that's going to be real interesting, and it's important because it is their 200th anniversary. We don't have anything pinned down yet for the week after that, which will be the 15th. But I think we're going to have some Iraq War vets come and tell us about their experiences in recent wars. So that's going to be really, really great also. It'll be completely different from our Randolph County history, but I think it'll be important for us to learn. And then our final session is August the 22nd. And then, of course, we're going to try to do some more in the winter and maybe next spring. But our final one for this part of the series will be August 22nd. And Ann is going to be back featuring growing up here in the 30s. And she's got some great stories because I've been hearing them all my life. So that's going to be really good. But thank you all for coming. And I think it's been a real successful series. Don't you all? I mean, it is things that we would continue to do. And so, Mike Dunn, Virginia Stevens, growing up here in the 40s and 50s.
All right, well, I'll mess you up. I'll set that chair down there in front of you.
There's a couple of them right there.
Yeah, sit over here.
Oh, all right.
One up here for Barbara. We didn't go
No, Virginia and I kind of sit down and start talking about this and realized that the more we talked, the longer this thing was going to get. So we had to kind of tone it down just a little bit, and we do have it divided up. She's going to talk about the 40s, and I'm going to talk about the late 40s and the early 50s. But the funny part about it is I look around this room, and there's an awful lot of people that lived with me during this time, and I'm looking at Billy Don and Peggy
with you?
With me. Yeah, in the same neighborhood.
Nice neighborhood.
And so when I get to be down to my part of it, we're going to wind up asking them to help us out and remember some of the things that happened. Not going to tell it all, okay, but some of it. So I'm going to turn it over to Virginia now, and she can start out with her 40s.
Well, actually, I'm going to start just a little bit earlier than the 40s because I know I look young, but I guess I'm going to tell my age tonight because I was born in an old house that sits over in this, what we call the south end of town, across from the old hospital in Randolph home. I was born and raised there in that house. I was born on September the 7th, 1931. So you do the math, and you'll find out how old I am. Is it really? Well, we're going to have to celebrate. Yeah, we'll have to have a party. Well, I was born right at the end of the Great Depression. It had just ended, and I know that everybody was having a hard time at that time to growing up in that time. We were all poor, but we didn't know we were poor. You know, we were so happy, and it was such a good place to grow up. I wouldn't take anything for growing up here in Pocahontas. It was a good, safe, little sleepy country town. We could go out and play all day long, never have to worry about somebody grabbing you off the street and running off with you like it is now. It was safe. And it was a good, just a wonderful place to grow up. Started school up here in the old school in my first grade up there in the old red brick 2-story building that's set up where the tennis courts are now. It was a wonderful old building. The 1st through 6th grade went downstairs, and the 7th through 12th grade went upstairs. And of course, when you were downstairs, you were very jealous of the ones upstairs. You thought the day would never come when you got to go up those stairs. But it did, and you felt like you were really important then. But I do want to add, before I start in on the 40s, I want to tell you all some history that happened right here in this room that I think everyone might be interested in hearing. I don't know if you all, I'm sure a number of you remember Hubbell's Shoe Store. And it was right here in this room for many years. Well, they carried a brand of shoe called Buster Brown, made by the Brown Shoe Company. So, the Brown Shoe Company made special order shoes for the tallest person that was ever born in the world. And his name was Robert Wadlow. And he wore an 18.5 shoe. He was over 8 foot tall, almost 9 foot tall. Well, Brown Shoe Company was going to bring him to Pocahontas. And of course now they would say his parents were exploiting him by putting him out in the public. But at that time, you know, we didn't have all this nonsense, and everybody was excited about him coming. So they had one of his shoes set right up here in this front window, and it was full of pennies. And they told that the kids here in town, up to the age of 12, could guess at the amount of pennies in the shoe, and then they would win a prize the day that Robert Wadlow came. So Mother brought me and my brother and sister up here, and the street was just full of people out here, and everybody was waiting to see him. And on Wikipedia, right now, it says that he is recorded as the tallest person ever born in the world. And he was very young at that time. He was about 18 years old, something like that. He died at the age of 22 a few years later, so I would guess he was around 18. But anyway, he came, and they brought him out front, and everybody saw him, and then they took him away in a car. And I don't remember who won the prize, but I got a pair of Buster Brown shoes. Do you remember, Ann?
Well, it wasn't me.
Well, then I don't remember either who won. But anyway, it was quite an exciting thing to see him, and I remembered what a pleasant, sweet face smile he had and everything. He was just, you just can't imagine the height. And if you wanted to see him, you can go on Wikipedia, and they have pictures of him on there. And but that's some history of our annex, and I thought that might be something interesting you all might enjoy hearing.
Virginia, he also came back every year for about 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
He always got a big crowd.
Yes, there was always a big crowd. He lived in Illinois somewhere, and they brought him down. But that was something that I remember at about 8 or 9 years old. And then I started school, like I said, in the 1st grade. And I've always liked to talk. I know people that know me don't know that. And you really don't notice how much I talk. But in the 1st grade in school, my teacher was Miss Katie Hughes. And a friend of mine, Donna, and I, we always had to kind of whisper and talk to each other. So one day, we got caught. Miss Kate, that was against the rules, of course, to talk. Because you could walk in that school up there, and it had from 1st through 12th grade in that building up there, but you could walk in the front door, and I guarantee you, you could almost heard a pin drop. Because back in those days, kids stayed in their seats, and they listened, and they were quiet, and they behaved themselves. And so Miss Katie caught us talking, and so she called us to the front. Scared us to death. Well, she went to the blackboard, and she drew a little ring right over here. And then she went over here and she drew another little ring. And then she said, all right now, girls, you've got to stand up here and put your nose in that ring and stand there for 10 minutes. And we did. Of course, we cried the whole time. And I always remembered that standing with my nose in the ring for talking, but it didn't stop me, so. And it did not scar me for life. And to this day, I don't have nightmares about standing with my nose in that ring, and my mother probably thought I deserved it and didn't say a word. Today, if your kid went home and told their parent they had to do that, no telling what the parent would do. But back then were different days.
Yeah.
So then another time, of course, Donna and I got in trouble again. And we sat close together, so we whispered something. And that time, we had to go sit in the hall in a little chair and miss story time. Because Miss Katie would read a chapter every day of some book like the Bobbsey Twins or something. And so we sat out in the hall and cried for that length of time again. And I don't think that scarred either one of us either. So by this time then, a few years passed and we had our ups and downs. And in the 5th grade, we had, I really believe, colder winters and more snow back then, because in the 5th grade, Miss Vera Price was our teacher. And when it was real cold winter time, nearly every child, we didn't have a lunchroom at school then. We took our lunches, and you'd be surprised how many biscuit sandwiches you saw at lunchtime. And Miss Vera would have us bring a little bit of milk. You know, we'd take a little fruit jar with milk in it, and she would raise the windows, because there was big windows all the way down the side of our room. And we'd set our little jars of milk out on the ledge. Well, a lot of times by noon, you'd have little ice crystals around it, because it was so cold. But that kept our milk cold, and then we ate lunch at our desk, and we'd get our little jar of milk and sit there and drink it. And those are just little tidbits of things that happened back in the olden times. So then I got to be 10 years old, and all those years, you could walk back and forth to school. Parents didn't worry about their children here. You'd go out and play all day, and your mother might not even know where you were all day. But we walked back and forth to school, and I walked from out, of course you heard the story of old people that said, well, I walked, 20 miles in deep snow to get to school. But I did walk every day. A lot of kids did. Everybody walked. We didn't have buses. We all walked. Wherever we lived, we walked to school. So from out there on that hill on this side of the old hospital, I walked all the way up to North Mar to that school. And you didn't have to worry. But at the age of 10, it was 1941, and on December the 7th, this town, it started the beginning of the end of the quiet and the peacefulness of our little country town. Because the United States government decided to build an air base. And they built it over between here and Walnut Ridge, as most of you know, where the air base is. And it was quite a large operation. It was a training field. So hundreds of soldiers hit Pocahontas. And they were in the at the air base, stationed over there. And, of course, a lot of them had their families with them when they came to Pocahontas. And so everybody that had a room to rent, or even some people took outbuildings and turned them into little apartments for the soldiers and their families to live in that were here in town, the ones that brought their families. Of course, all the rest of them were stationed over at the air base. So we had a lot of goings on here in town at that time. A lot of people moved in. Houses started being built, and Pocahontas really started growing. But along with that, of course, comes times when it changed. It wasn't the quiet, good country town that it had always been. And of course, we felt like we lived out in the country, living that far out. We had a milk cow, and we had chickens, and my mother always had a big, big garden, and she canned and did all of that. And as I said, I guess we were poor, but we didn't know we were. And kids back then, we had imagination because we didn't have many toys. Nobody had toys. We weren't the only ones. I mean, people didn't go crazy at Christmas and buy you everything under the sun. And so you used your imagination. And, you know, we could imagine up a lot. I mean, not everybody can imagine a horse playing cowboy and Indians and everything else. And we'd walk to the show on Saturday afternoons because we did have a theater back then. It wasn't that far back in time. And all the kids would come to the show on Saturday afternoons. And during the summertime, as young girls, we'd get out and we'd have bunking parties. And we'd go out at 3 o'clock in the morning when we were, say, 15, 16 years old. It was nothing for us to come up here to what was the post office then, and I don't know about some of the rest of you, but I still go to the post office to get the Star Herald. I'm always telling Bert, let's run down to the post office. I want to see if they have the stars out. Because it'll always be the post office to me. And but we'd go out there. My best friend, lived in a house down here in front of the Old Million Motor Company where they have the ice thing now. And so we'd sneak out down there and go up and swing on the flagpole. And if we saw a car light coming, we'd run and hide behind the bushes there until they passed by. And it'd be Butch or Estill one because Estill was the town, or Butch was the town marshal at night, usually Butch stole. And sometimes we'd go out and ride our bicycles, and he'd stop and say, you girls all right? And we'd say, yeah, well, y'all be careful now. Go on home pretty soon. We'd say, okay, we will. And we didn't have to be afraid. But of course, after the war started and all of that happened, why, it got a little different then, and our parents worried more about us. And during that time, I'll turn this over to Mike here in just a minute, but during this time, there was a time when, I think they called it a bivouac deal, where the soldiers were coming into town. They said there was a huge convoy going to hit Pocahontas. And the pasture down behind Price Chopper and down in there was always known as Kaiser Pasture, because Mr. John Kaiser owned that. And so they had made arrangements that they were coming down to Kaiser Pasture, and they would have all of these little pup tents. And we lived up on that hill so we could look out over Kaiser Pasture, and it was as far as you could see in every direction was rows and rows and rows of pup tents. And they were down there for days. Well, my sister, who happened to be Linda's mother, she and her girlfriend spent the biggest part of the time during that time sitting on the bank down there waving at the soldiers. Mother, Daddy would say, now, you know, you don't go down there and talk to them. You sit back up here. Daddy said, I better not see a soldier coming up this direction. But they enjoyed that part of seeing all the soldiers, and it was fun. They were down there for, I don't even remember how many days, but they were there for a long time. So I'm going to tell a couple more things that I'm going to tell, that I'm going to just be real honest tonight. In my lifetime, I have stolen 2 things. So I'm confessing my sins. One time, a lot of you remember probably a boy by the name of Eli Abbott, who grew up here in this old 2-story red brick house where the Blue Bird restaurant is now. Well, Eli had a little coupe that had a rumble seat on the back, just a little 2-person coupe. and he painted it bright green. Oh, it was a beautiful car. And so one Saturday night, it was loaded with kids. I don't know how many kids were in that car, but hanging on it and everything else. So we went over to East Pocahontas down what is now Pace Road, and Mr. Wayman had a watermelon patch. Well, while two of the boys went down and bought a watermelon, the rest of the boys were loading watermelons into this car, and I don't know how in the world us kids all got back on the car. But we went out to Mascliffe Creek, built a bonfire, and had a watermelon feast. So that's one confession. Now the next one is not so nice. We girls, we really should have been just, well, I don't know what should have happened to us for that. But my friend was David Boland's grandfather's stepdaughter, and he had built a cabin out on 11 Point River, and right next door to the Martin cabin, Mr. Lanny Martin had a big cabin out there. So we would go out there a lot, all of us girls. There'd be 6 or 8 of us go and spend the weekend, and we were out there one weekend, and so we were sitting down on the dock, and these fishermen came down the river, and they said, "Hey girls, we caught a whole lot of catfish today. Would y'all like to have a big catfish for your supper?" And we said, "Yes, we'd love to." So we wallered that catfish all over the kitchen of that cabin trying to figure out how to skin it. We couldn't figure out. We finally poured boiling water on it and got the skin on it. But we saved enough fish to have supper. Well, anyway, we were getting our fish all cut up and ready, and somebody said, "Oh, I wish we had an onion." And somebody else said, "You can't eat catfish without an onion." And we knew we just couldn't, but we were out there on the river. We didn't know where we were going to get an onion. So Guyleen speaks up, and she says, "Wonder if Miss Martin would have one over there at her cabin." And we said, well, we didn't know, but, you know, we could go look. Well, we went over there, and we were peeping through the back door glass into the kitchen. And it had little panes of glass, you know, how they have those 6 or 8, 9 panes, however many. And the door was locked. But there on the counter was a big old bowl, and it had some potatoes and 2 or 3 great big pretty white onions. So somebody said, well, you know, we could break one of these glasses. Somebody else said, well, we probably could, and Guyleen said, I bet Daddy Ray would put a glass back in there. You know, he wouldn't care. So we all stood there and convinced ourselves that it would be okay to break into Martin's cabin. So we did. We got the onion. We ate our catfish and our onion. And just tickled, well, we had potatoes. So, you know, that was just the absolute best catfish and onions I ever remember eating. And needless to say, we all got in a little bit of trouble, and Daddy Ray Boland told us, I'll tell you girls one thing. You can go out to that cabin and you can stay the weekend and you can have a lot of fun, but if you ever break into Martin's cabin again, that's the last time you'll go out there. So that's really the worst things we ever did, because, you know, there were no drugs. There was no alcohol. I mean, we didn't, as we were growing up, we didn't even consider anything like that. We might pool our money and buy packs of cigarettes once in a while and try to smoke them, but we'd choke to death. So, you know, that was the worst thing that we all did, and we had fun, and there's no place on earth better to grow up than right here in Pocahontas, if you were safe. So now, Mike, you try to top that, because that's my story and I'm sticking to it.
I don't know, I better move over. It's criminal up here. I can only think of one. one thing I stole, and I think Billy Don may have been in on this. You remember the time we stole the pumpkins?
No.
I tell you what, I remember it vividly because my dad let me know it pretty good with an 18-inch ruler.
Well, my mother was worse than that. When I stole the pumpkins, she made me peel them and cook them.
I had to take mine back and apologize. Well, I didn't know how to approach this because I knew most of the people in the room would have the same, very similar remembrances that I have. And I was hoping that the audience would help me out. And so as I go through this, if I tweak a memory for you, don't hesitate to speak up and tell your experience as well. I divided mine up into 3 segments. First off is the neighborhood I grew up in and going to school, and then a segment I call me. And I'll take that one last. The neighborhood. Well, you're almost sitting in it because if there weren't any trees growing right in the back door of this place, you could see the house that I grew up in. It's right there on that hill on Vance Street. I lived in that house for 18 years. It's bordered, the neighborhood was bordered by a creek because Vance Street didn't go all the way through back in those days. It quit at Peggy's house on the south side. On the north side, it went up as far as Wiley Street, which Billy Don lived on. And to the east was a railroad track and the river. And to the west was Highway 67. And we normally did not get out of our neighborhood. We stayed right there. Once in a while, there would be some interlopers come through, guys like Bob and Frank Bigger, Larry Nybert. Some of those guys would come into the neighborhood, but most of the time we stayed to ourselves, didn't we, Billy Don?
Yeah, Robert Dawson.
Well, we had several families, and I want to name every family that was in the neighborhood. We had the Keiths, Cecil Keith, Sonny Keith, and then we had the Dawsons, Wilbur and Barbie Dawson, the McFatridges, Daryl, Darman, and Peggy. We had a family, and I don't know if you guys remember them or not, but their name was York, and they lived in the duplex. And the young man's name was Bobby Joe York, and I remember him this day because I have him pictured as being just like the guy in Peanuts with a round head. But they stayed until about the middle of the war, and then they went north to earn their fortune. We had the Romines, Bobby Romine, and the Shiveleys. All the Shively girls were in the neighborhood. Then we had a whole lot of families in the neighborhood, older folks like the Childs, Homer and Nellie Childs. We had the Argos, the Prombergers. We had, well, of course, Billy Don, I mentioned him, the Kincaids. Then we had the Mocks, Ms. Bertha Mock. Everybody remembers her as being a teacher. Yeah. The Bristows. Anybody remember the Bristow family? And then the Bowers. And you just stop and think, and you look at all of these families that were in that neighborhood in the 40s and 50s, and most of them are gone today. There are no Prombergers left. There are very few Romines. The Mocks, that particular branch of them, the Bristows and the Bowers, they're no longer in Pocahontas. Now my neighborhood, or my yard in the neighborhood, was kind of the gathering place because we had 2 lots. Our house was really small, so we had a big lot there, and that lot was a ball field. And first base was the Yorks' lilac bush. Second base was my mother's lilac bush. And the third base was a big cedar tree right next to our house. So we all gathered in that yard playing baseball. Now that was before we all got bicycles. after we got bicycles, we stretched it out a little bit, and we would make trips over to the Spikes. Dr. Spike, Bill and Jim Spike had a big baseball field in the back of the air yard, but they lived way out on Thomasville. And Lambert Blissenbach had a baseball field, and he lived way out. But once we got bicycles, we could go out there and play baseball. But until we got bicycles, we had to stay in my yard. But prior to that, and Miss Ann, you remember, you wrote an article about a tree in my backyard. A big oak tree.
It's on an insurance company's
Charter oak.
Well, that tree, it was the biggest white oak tree in the state of Arkansas. And it was in my backyard all the time I was growing up. And when they built the bypass, they cut it down.
Oh.
And that would really, really hurt. But we had more fun under that tree. We played cars and trucks. Anybody ever play cars and trucks?
Play marbles.
We played marbles. We had a swing. I mean, that tree gathered every kid in the neighborhood every day. We even got so sophisticated that when the Childs built a new house down the street, they had a little extra concrete left over, and we built concrete roads for our cars and trucks. So we really got sophisticated. The only time I got upset was my dad wouldn't let me take my electric train out there. But anyway, our yard was a gathering place, and it was clover. 100% clover. And every morning you'd get out, you'd go outside, and you'd get your feet wet if your mother would let you go out. And it was really easy to step on a bee. But the only place we could go barefoot was in the yard, because all of the streets in our neighborhood had crushed up shells as a base for the blacktop. And they had these old shells, and if you got out there, it'd cut your foot. And so we had to stay in our yard if we would go barefooted. Other than that, we had to wear shoes. Now, she said she lived out in the country, so she had a cow. Well, I can almost throw a rock to where we had our cow. We, all during the war, World War II, we had a cow. We had a big garden. And my mother and dad sold milk around town. Also, we didn't even own the land that the cow was on. It belonged to Miss Mock. And that is the lot where they dug out and have never put anything in over in North Vance on the bypass there. And that used to have a big barn on it, and we had more fun in that old barn as well. So we had a cow in town, almost near the court square. So that, but we didn't have to live in the country for that. No one, as I mentioned, no one had bikes during the war, until after the war was over. But when the war was over, everybody in the neighborhood got bicycles. And we would race them on Vance Street. We'd go down, go over on Thrill Hill, which is Dalton Street now. We all called it Thrill Hill. And we'd see if we could start at the top of Thrill Hill and coast all the way over to Highway 67, which is where the W.O. Marr Park is now. But sometimes you could make it, sometimes you couldn't, but it was still a lot of fun to take those bicycles out and go. And Billy Don, you remember the time we found out that we could take playing cards and attach it to the fenders on the bicycle and go brrrr as you rode it? It was great until it loosened all the spokes in your bicycle. But anyway, we had a great time. Now, I have probably attended more weddings than anybody in this room, and I've only been married one time. That's my first wife sitting right over there. But does anybody remember when Pocahontas was a marriage bill? During World War II, and I probably went back further than that. During World War II, the state of Arkansas had 2 laws that you had to pass, I guess, in order to get married. One was a blood test, and the other was that you had to wait 3 days. Now, they didn't want to rescind those laws, so what they did in their infinite wisdom, during the war, when the soldiers were wanting to get married before they shipped out, they came up with the deal that the county judge could sign a waiver on both of those, and the JP could marry you. Well, Pocahontas became the center of getting married for all the people that lived in St. Louis.
Oh, no.
And I just happened to live on Vance Street, and my house was the first house. The second house was the county judge, and the third house was the JP. And on weekends, they'd stop at our house to find out where to go to get married. And so whenever we were a bunch of kids be out and about, if we were down at the JP's house, we could watch the wedding. We were more or less witnesses to the wedding. So I probably attended more weddings than anybody in here. Another thing, there was a lot of us kids had swimming pools in our backyard in those days. We were uptown. And you know why? Because when they closed the air base, they had big auctions. And they sold a lot of 21-man life rafts. And every one of our folks went out and bought us a 20-man life raft because you could buy them for 25 bucks or less. And we brought them into the backyard and filled them up with water, and that was our swimming pool.
Black River was full of them, too.
Yeah. But those, everybody, a lot of kids had swimming pools in their backyard back in those days. We had a tree house. Remember the tree house, Bill Dunn, sitting behind my house?
Yeah.
It's sit right where those 2 big billboards are on the bypass right now. And it was quite a tree house. Every time there was a construction job, we'd get out, we'd take our wagons, and we'd go out to gather up all this material, and we built our tree house. Now, we never had a BB gun fight as such, but all of us had BB guns. But we were always prepared because we built that tree house and we lined it with good heavy cardboard from Bolin Furniture, old refrigerator cartons and whatnot. We lined the tree house with that cardboard so nobody could shoot us with BB guns. We had gun ports and everything, but we never got into a BB gun fight. I mentioned Ms. Childs. Mrs. Childs was the savior of the neighborhood. Anytime one of us kids got into trouble and we didn't want to go home, we'd go to Miss Childs. And one time I was messing around and I stuck these 2 fingers into 2 bottles. They were probably beer bottles, and I couldn't get them out. And so rather than going home, I went to Miss Childs, and she took a hammer and she broke them off, and I still have the scar on this finger where we broke those things off. Miss Childs also, in the summer months, her husband had a river boat that sold groceries to all the houseboats up and down Black River. And she would gather up a lot of the stuff that he had on the boat, and in the summer months she'd call all the kids there to her house in the afternoon, and she'd all give us all a pack of Kool-Aid. And what we'd do is take that Kool-Aid and put it in her hand.
Yeah.
And Mrs. Childs was the kids' favorite in the whole neighborhood. So another thing that we did is that we liked to go down on the railroad track. We had a train in those days. We call it the Tri-Weekly. It went up one week and tried to come back the next. But it only came through twice a day. And we would go go down and we'd put pennies on the railroad track and let them mash them flat for us. And also the water tank sit right behind my house, and so we could go down a little path and get down to the water tank. And in the summertime, if our mothers would let us put our bathing suit on, we'd go down there and stand under the water tank when it overfilled, and it was like taking a shower. So, you know, we had a good time with that. Okay, school. I started the first grade in the same building that she was in, the old two-story on North Mar. And I started in 1944. I was born in 1938, and I started in 1944. Well, you know what that was? That was right in the middle of World War II. She talked about the air base and all the people that came in. There were a world of kids that came into Pocahontas during those days. So my whole first grade, I only went half a day. You had a morning session and you had an afternoon session. And just in order to get all the kids through. Now, fortunately, in 45 and 46, the air base started winding down, and we got to go a full day there. But it was first grade, half a day only. Now, she said the grade school in that building was on the ground floor, and the high school was on the top floor, the upper floor. Well, that worked until the war was over. And then all of a sudden building materials became reasonably plentiful, so they built a fine new high school building behind that old building. And so when I was in the 5th grade, rather than being in high school, I got to go upstairs. Now, I don't know, Don, Peggy, you guys, do you remember, Will, Nancy, the grade school, or the study hall, where the floor opened up and we had fire drills? Right in the middle of the study hall was a big old door, and it was huge. And every time we had a fire drill, the bell would ring. They had 2 kids appointed to go over and raise that door, and we had to go through the floor and go out of the building. So that you don't remember that floor? If you came in the door and looked, there was a stair that went to nowhere, unless you opened that door. We didn't have a lunchroom, so we had to take our own lunch, or we had to go home. But if you were in an upper grade, say 4th, 5th, 6th grade, and even high school, we could go to Will S. White's store.
Oh, yeah.
And Will S. White had hot dogs and hamburgers and pop-up and Cokes. And you could buy all of that for about a quarter. And if you were in with the teachers enough, you could get appointed to the safety patrol that got you across the street off Highway 67, and Will S. would give you a free hot dog. So that we either went home, walked home, and I was only about 3 blocks from the school, so I got to walk home when I ate there. But when my mother worked, well, I had to eat at school, and so I ate a lot over at Will S. White's store. Now, eventually, we got a lunchroom. And I don't know if you all remember the old gym that sit up there.
Yeah.
Well, the lunchroom was built attached to that. It was kind of a basement. And that was our lunchroom that we got to use. And in fact, that lunchroom was used even when we moved to the new building out on Thomasville, which is still being used today, and that was 60 years ago. But they would put us on buses, and they would bus us to that lunchroom. We'd eat lunch, and then we'd bus back to the high school building. So that lunchroom was used for a long time, even after the new school was built. Just to tell you that I remember every one of my teachers. Mrs. Earl Smith was my first grade teacher. Mrs. Mona Spikes not Miss Alma, Miss Mona was my second grade teacher. And Mrs. Smith, and I cannot remember her name, but she was a sister-in-law to Mrs. Earl Smith. Who? Alene, that's right. Ms. Bertha Mock was my fourth grade teacher. And believe it or not, I had two fifth grade teachers, Mildred Nickel and Virginia McNabb. And they split it up. Ms. Nickel taught math and science, and Miss Virginia taught English and social studies. So that was my fifth grade. And then the sixth grade, I had a man, and that was a real change for me. And I remember his last name, but I don't remember his first name. It was James, Mr. James. And that's the first time that we ever had, huh?
I thought it was James Harris.
No, it was James. It was James. And that was the first time I can ever recall having to line up around the room and have spelling bees and math bees. And when you missed something, you had to sit down. Hey, I'm not even halfway through. I told you, the longer I got this, the more I thought of it. And it could go on forever. But I'll quickly go through it. Recess at the old building. There was a big old piece of ground that used to be the football field back in the 30s. And it was our recess area, and we played a lot of marbles. Billy Don, if you remember. Huh? Leapfrog. We played keepers. Remember keepers?
Oh, yeah.
Drop box. You remember drop box? Where you get a cigar box, you cut a hole in it, and then if a guy could drop a marble and it go in the hole, you got two back. I mean, we got to gambling early in life. But that drop box was a big game for us. And of course, we did leapfrog, tag, and later in the later grades, touch football. Now, the football field in those days was out at where the school is now. But it's where the baseball field was. And in baseball season, they had the bleachers set up just like they do today. But when football season came, they hooked a tractor to the bleachers and they drug them around and they lined them up and they had a football field. There was only one little problem with that. That football field was nothing but mud and rock. The only touchdown I ever scored in my high school football career was covering a fumble in the end zone in a mud pile. So we didn't have much grass. Now, when I was in the 7th grade, you were in the 8th, you were in the 8th, I was in the 7th, Billy Don was in the 7th. We moved to the new school. And that was a great move. Everybody was happy with it. Brand spanking new. And all the grade school had to stay over at the old building. But again, we didn't have a lunchroom. And the rock building, which is now the lunchroom and the weight room and all of that, wasn't anything but an old burned out hulk. There wasn't anything standing but the rock walls. And they started working on that and filled that in and made at that time, an auditorium, a lunchroom, a band room, and a chemistry lab out of it. And Southern Baptist, right. But it sat there for years before anything was ever done with it. It was just an old burned out hulk. And it stayed that way through my 7th and 8th grade. So, and we had, go out for football, there wasn't any place to dress. We had to get on a bus and drive over to, back to the gym, dress out for football, go out to the field, practice, get on the bus, drive back. Same thing with basketball. Boys and girls basketball, we all had to get on the bus and go back to the gym. And
shower?
Yeah, we did.
The girls
didn't. Okay.
You had to do 10 laps around the field when you got on the bus, and when you got off the bus, you had to do 10 laps.
Exactly. Yeah. So that was kind of an unusual situation for years. Just a little side note, I had played football my 8th, 9th, 10th and 11th year, I did not play my senior year because I was working at the shoe factory after school as a chief chemical engineer. I filled the glue cans. But my senior or junior year in football, we won one game. One game. Very few cars, very few people own cars. Dickie Ray Trammell was probably the only one in our class that had one.
Two-tone green, wasn't it?
Yeah, his first one was a 54 two-tone green Bel Air Chevrolet.
Wayne Arnold had one.
Yeah, but he didn't have a new one. Wayne, yeah, that would be debatable whether Wayne had a car or not. I mean, it was 4 wheels and an engine, yeah. And no driver's ed. We had to learn on the street, just like, you know, with nobody. And I started driving at 13. When I was 11 years old, my dad bought me a horse. I couldn't stand that blessed horse. The day I turned 13, I sold that horse and bought me a Jeep. And I drove that Jeep until, well, first date Barb and I ever had was in that Jeep. Barb, the Jeep, and my dog. No bus service for anybody in town. The only kids that got to ride the bus were those that lived way out. Now, Randolph Ford lived out at Surridge, and he was a darn good football player. And so they tried to accommodate him every way they could, and of course he couldn't ride the bus home at night if he stayed for football practice. So they gave him an old used school bus to drive back and forth. Now would you believe it happened today? But they just took one that they were about ready to junk and they let him drive it home. Well, that turned out to be pretty good for the rest of us because he'd stop and pick us up in the morning and take us home in the evening in that old school bus. So we had bus service. He had no other students to drive him. Okay. Another thing, and some of you might remember, in the evenings we did a lot of hanging out, but it wasn't at the Tasty Freeze or anywhere. It was at the Rendezvous.
Yeah.
And if you, at the Rendezvous, sit right over here on Pirate Street, and there's a little incline going up. And I remember one night, she kept talking about Butch and Estill. Somebody got the bright idea that they would take a used motor oil and pour on the street. And so when you pulled up to the stop sign and stopped for the stop sign and tried to go, you couldn't go. And we were all out there, and cars would pull up and try to go, and then we'd run out there and push them on and whatnot. We were all standing there, and up rose Butch. And he decided he was going to take us all in. Well, he started to take us all in, but we got down here. At that time, City Hall was here in the old courthouse building. And he got us all down there, and he said, okay, guys, you can go home, but I hope you learned your lesson. So I don't think we ever poured oil on the street again. Okay, I've got 5 minutes, so I'm going to quickly do me. I was born in '38, as I said, and just a little side note, Dick McFall and I, most of you have heard of Dick McFall. Dick and I were lifelong buddies, and truly lifelong, because he was 2 weeks older than I was. He was born in the same hospital, in the same room that our mothers had, and we were buddies till the day he died. And it was in the Lucy Lee Hospital in Poplar Bluff, Missouri. Now that's the only black mark that I can say, because I'm the only member of my family, both me, my kids, my wife, were all born in Arkansas, but I was born in Missouri. As I mentioned, first 10 years was at in this little house right up here on the hill. What I remember about the war years, number one was ration stamps. Do you remember ration stamps? And we'd save ration stamps so that we'd have enough gas to get up to my grandmother's house at Biggers. So we'd go up there every weekend, and we would, all the cousins would gather, and we'd play and throw corn cobs at each other and stuff like that. But one thing I remember about ration stamps, where the theater is now, Well, they had that building that joins the Imperial, the next door where the barber shop was and the beauty shop is, that was Fulmer's Food Center. And Mr. Fulmer was a good friend of my mother's. And when during the war, when he would get in a box of Hershey bars, he might get in one a month or one every 2 or 3 months, he'd call my mother and he would say, send Mike and his ration stamps down so he can have a Hershey bar. And so I got supplied with Hershey's during World War II. My dad worked in the egg plant, which is down below the hill down there where Fitness Works is located now. During World War II, that was an egg drying plant. And they would ship carloads of eggs in there, and they would dry them and make powdered egg out of them to ship overseas to our service people.
Smell to high heaven.
And it really did smell. But I ate a lot of powdered eggs because my dad worked down there. My mother was a hostess at the USO, and that's where all of the soldiers and Marines came on the weekends, and it was upstairs over here at in the old courthouse. And early on, the air base trained Army pilots, but later on they transferred it from the Army to the Marines. And in the latter part of World War II, that was a Marine base, not an Army base. Army Air Force, it was Marines. And I would go up there if Dad had to go to a city council meeting or something like that. I'd go with my mother, and I was up there with her probably 1 or 2 nights a week. And a Marine took a real shine to me, and he would let me play pool with him and that kind of thing. And I don't know where he had it done, but I suspect it was the tailor shop at the air base, but he had a full-blown Marine uniform made for me. Wow. I was 6 years old, and I don't have it today. My mother was not a pack rat by any stretch of imagination. She thoroughly believed you didn't use it within a year, it was gone. And so she threw it away. But I remember that uniform. My dad and I, on Saturdays, it was a 7-day-a-week thing from the airport, air base. And right over here where the airport is now was what we called a P field for the air base. And the guys would do touch and goes over there all day. Cool. And so my dad and I would walk the railroad bridge, and we would walk over there and watch them do those touch and goes as the airplanes come in, touch down, take off. They had 2 P fields in Randolph County, this one here and one up at between Biggers and Reno. There was only one dad in the neighborhood that was in the service. My dad was quite a bit older. He was 33 when the war started. They did call him, but he was deaf in one ear totally and partially deaf in another, so he didn't have to go. And others in the neighborhood were too old. There was only one man, father in the whole neighborhood that was in the Army, and that was Dow Dawson. And I specifically remember VJ Day just because Dow was in the Pacific Theater, and when VJ happened, we knew he was coming home. During the war, we burned wood, and guess where that wood came from? We didn't go out and chop it. We got it down at Slee's Mill, which were the cut-off blocks, hickory blocks from the Hamel Mill. And they'd take a dump truck and bring it up and dump it in our yard. And one of my jobs was to take those hickory blocks and put it in the wood box on the back porch. Greatest thing that ever happened is when the D clerks brought in LP gas. We switched to LP, and then we upgraded to natural gas when they piped the town. Telephone. First telephone I remember was a hand cranks in the hall. You cranked it up, and the operator came on and said, "Number, please." I never forget where my mother worked. The number was 9-1. We upgraded that to a handheld job where you picked it up and the operator came on and said, "Number, please." And then later on, we got a dial phone. Long distance, you couldn't call anywhere for less than $10. You just did. You only call long distance when there was a death in the family. Pardon?
An emergency.
Oh, emergency, yeah.
What was your house number, Mike? What was your home number?
I don't remember because I never called it.
309J was ours.
309J. Well, we were on a party line, so were you, weren't you?
Yeah.
Everybody was back then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nobody had TVs. Wasn't commercially available then. Later on in the early 50s, Boss Equipment got one, and the screen was about yay big around. And on Wednesday nights, they'd let everybody come in down there on the showroom floor and watch boxing matches. Then later on, Rainwater, Johnny Cadner, which was right down here where LMA had her store, set one up in the window. And so when we'd line up to go to the movie, we could walk by Johnny and he'd leave that thing on till about 10, 11 at night, and we could watch television in his store window. Then Tom Cook put in a TV store, and if you were interested in buying one, Tom would bring one out to your house, and the antenna would be on a two-wheel trailer. And he'd pull it up beside the house and crank the antenna up, and he'd hook up the TV, and you could watch TV at the house. A lot of snow. And but I remember the first TV we got. We just
The Indian on the screen.
yeah, the test pattern. But the first TV we got was just like a big piece of furniture, big blonde piece of furniture, but it only had a 27-inch screen. And the only reason we got it is because Dad wanted to watch the Republican convention when Eisenhower was nominated. After school in the afternoons, before TV, we'd come home, we'd listen to the radio, Sky King, Sergeant Preston. At night, we'd listen to Jack Benny, Amos and Andy, Bing Crosby, all on the radio. But the thing I remember most about it was during the war years, and the news would come on, and my dad would be tuned to it. And I just thought to myself, I'll be glad when this war is over and we won't have to listen to news anymore. And I remember that so well. Kurt River Beach. Can't do anything without remembering Kurt River Beach, because that was a home away from home. I went to Kurt River Beach from the time I was 18 months old until my kids, I took them up there. So Kurt River Beach was just a place to be and a place to go, and we hung out a lot up there. And even when we were working, we'd get off from work and we'd go to Kurt River Beach. When I would work at the gas plant, Barbara would meet me up at Kurt River Beach, and we'd stay there until it was dark. So I can't say enough about Kurt River Beach. Well, that's my story. I'm sticking to it.
Wait a minute. You forgot to say anything about you being the drum major in the band. You were the best drum major in the world.
I was the first male drum major Pocahontas High School ever had.
I'd like to add something about the operator when you said number, please.
We call her Central.
Well, I don't know what we called her. Juanita's what we called her. Because I'm going to tell a little story now on Linda. Linda, of course, is my niece. And when she was born, we thought she was the only child ever born on this earth. I mean, my daddy absolutely worshipped that child. Everything was just about Linda. Well, one day when Linda was about 2 years old or something like that, our phone rang. And Daddy happened to be sitting right there by it, and he answered it. He said, hello, and it was Linda. And he said, oh, well, sister, baby. And he talked to her a minute. He said, Papa, I'll be right over there. Well, later on, Daddy went over there to get her, and Geraldine said, well, Daddy, what are you doing here? And he said, well, Sister Baby called me. She said you were being mean to her, and I come to get her. And we couldn't figure out how she called Papa, because she wasn't old enough to even know what a number was. Well, Sunday at church, Juanita Kavner, who was the telephone operator here, was laughing, and she said, well, the other day, she said, their phone was picked up, and I said, number please. And Linda says, I want to talk to my papa. So she knew who Papa was, so she rang our house and got Papa, and he rescued that pitiful child that was being so mistreated. My daddy, when she would be at our house, and if she ate crackers or anything and left crumbs on the table, he'd say, you just leave those alone. Don't you clean those up. I can look at those and think about that little sister baby. So Linda learned to use the telephone at a mighty young age. But she was a pretty good kid, I guess.
Yeah, still is.
Anyway, Mike, I enjoyed all of your growing up years. I know
It was a good childhood.
it was a wonderful childhood, and I'm telling you, anybody that grew up here in those days was very fortunate. He was talking about the study hall. I'm not going to talk as long as I did a while ago, but I want to add a couple of things. Talking about the study hall, I know that a number of you in this room remember Miss Alma.
Oh, yeah.
There was nobody like Miss Alma Spikes.
I did.
You did?
Loved her. I loved her.
Oh, I loved her too. We all loved Miss Alma. I mean, she was
We were
great.
scared to death of her.
Well, we're scared to death of her, but she was all bark and no bite. I can still see her looking over her glasses like that, you know, at us. But one day I'm going to tell the joke on Miss Alma, and I'll never forget it. We had a blackboard in that study hall. It had a big wide doorway, and you could go out that doorway from the study hall into the hallway and then down the steps. And if you needed to go to the restroom, you went up, and everything had to be perfectly quiet in there, of course. The whole school was absolutely so quiet. Well, you'd write your initial or your name or whatever you wanted to write on the blackboard. And then you'd go down to the restroom, and then you'd come back and erase your name. Well, Miss Alma could glance up. Never supposed to be more than 2 names at a time on there. You had to wait until there was only 1 name before you wrote yours. So Miss Alma said in a pretty loud voice, she said, all right, now, who is the smart aleck in here? Well, everybody looked up. We didn't know what was going on. And we didn't know. And she said, who is the smart aleck? Look up there. Now, who is the smart aleck in here? Which one of you have done that? And on the blackboard, it said P.H.S. And we didn't know. Nobody would admit to it. We didn't know who'd written P.H.S. up there, which ordinarily would be Pocahontas High School. Well, Miss Alma was really getting upset with all of us. Now, I want to know who did this, she said, because this is not funny. Well, in a minute, a lot of you will know this name. Here comes Perry Hyde Stubblefield. Walking in, raised the initials, went over and sat down, and Miss Alma was like this. So and of course, needless to say, the study hall just fell apart. We had a really big laugh.
You know, we always talk about Miss Alma, but does anybody remember Beulah Filer?
Oh, yeah.
Now, I thought the world of that woman.
Yeah.
I remember her shoes.
Yeah. Yep, she was a true Wisconsinite. I mean, I worked Wisconsin, and if you wanted to pick somebody that was truly an example of somebody from Wisconsin, she was. Okay, and anytime you wanted to get her to distracted, all you had to do was say, sing on Wisconsin story. And but the thing that I remember most about her was that Miss Filer didn't drive until late in life. And her husband's name was Heine, and Heine was a good friend of my dad's because he was the manager at the egg plant during the war that my dad worked for. And Mrs. Filer finally learned to drive. Heine had passed away, and she needed to be able to drive. So she bought her a Pontiac that had a Dynaflow transmission or something like that in it. Well, she didn't like low gear because that was too slow. She didn't like high gear because that was too fast. Second was perfect. And she would put that car in second gear. Well, first off, she'd load all us kids in there after a play practice or something like that, and she'd take us home. And she'd put that car into second gear, put the accelerator almost to the floor, and slowly let the clutch out. She'd get it rolling. And then when she got to your house, she would smash the clutch, let up on the gas, and holler, "Hop out!" And you had to hop out of that car while it was still moving. She never would stop. But she was one of the greatest teachers, mathematics and the whole bit.
Well, I'm going to add something about Miss Filer. I loved her too, and Miss Filer was rather heavy set. Very sweet lady. Nearly always a little bit late for class. Not very much, but just a little bit. And one day somebody made a remark to her when she came in the room. And she turned around and looked at him, one of the boys in our class, and she said, "Now listen here. I'm built for comfort, not for speed." And I always remember Miss Filer saying.
Thank you so much for your attention tonight. Well, Max?
Comments and questions?
I was thinking, you talking about the old school building, you talking about the fire drills, if you remember, during the winter, at least once a week we'd have a drill. They thought the boiler was going to blow up.
Yeah.
We were all down in the old gym one morning, have PE or something, when the Diane Theater in that block blew up.
Oh.
And, well, of course, we heard the explosion, and the windows kind of rattled, and somebody looked around and said, "Well, I guess the boiler's blowing."
Hey, my that was when they was upstairs in school and they wouldn't let us out of school.
Exactly. I remember that day well, too, because
the
windows, I was sitting right next to the window, and that window just gave it that, and what's going on? And Will S. packed up lunches and brought them over to us. They wouldn't let us out of school. Of course, there's some of them slipped out of school and went down there.
They gave you a quarter to go if you wanted to. They loaned you some money to buy your lunch.
Yeah, that's right. He didn't give it to us. We had to buy it. But if you didn't have the money, you could bring it the next day.
Whatever happened to the old sundial that was out?
I don't know. And I had that in my notes, and I didn't mention it. But we had.
My class gave that stuff.
Oh, yeah. Well, I remember the sundial, but also there's one thing we did all during the war. And the only time we didn't do it was when it was raining. We had flag raising ceremonies every morning out in front of the building. The flagpole near where the sundial was, and it had a circle around it. And we'd all gather out there and pledge allegiance and have a prayer and before school started. Couldn't do that today, could we?
No, they couldn't do that today.
Any other questions? Red?
I can tell you why they didn't have very many televisions then. They cost $600. You buy a new Chevrolet car for $900. That's pretty expensive compared to that today. See, how many people have televisions if they cost 2/3 of what a new Chevrolet car costs?
I doubt there'd be very many.
Hey, Mike, you remember your dad worked the post office, and inside they had a mural painting or something, I know.
Yeah,
Old painting.
Yeah.
And they took it down. And I was in there one day and I asked your dad, I said, what happened to that painting? He said, he looked at it and said, well, I don't know, but I'll find out. The next time I come in there, he said it was in a museum somewhere.
Yeah, it's in a museum in Jonesboro, ASU.
They've restored it a little bit and it's beautiful. Is it?
Any others?
But I think we ought to have it back.
Yeah. Start a movement.
They said they lend it to us, but they're not gonna give it to us.
What are y'all talking about?
The mural.
Oh,
The mural.
Can you believe that? I know it.
Well, thanks again. It's been a pleasure.
Great.
Hopefully triggered some memories for you.
Come and enjoy some refreshments and